The Wrong Bride. The advertisement had been specific about two things: the man's name and the fact that he needed a woman of good character. It said nothing about what a woman of good character was supposed to do when she stepped off a train in the middle of Montana territory and found herself looking at the wrong man entirely. Nora Calloway had read the advertisement so many times on the journey west that the paper had gone soft at the folds. Colt Briggs, it said. Proprietor. Red Rock County. She had studied that name the way she used to study ledger columns, looking for what it promised and what it might be hiding. A man who described himself as a proprietor instead of a rancher either had more to his name than cattle, or he wanted people to think he did. A man who placed an advertisement for an educated woman of good character rather than a good cook or a strong worker was a man who had decided that intelligence was the thing he was missing. She had found both observations moderately encouraging, which was the most encouragement she could afford at the time. The man holding a card with her name on it was not Colt Briggs. He was somewhere north of 55, built like a fence post, left out in too many winters. Not weak, but scoured down to the essential. His hair had gone the color of iron filings, and his eyes were the same shade. And he held the card with her name written on it, the way a man holds a piece of paper that belongs to him, not the person it's addressed to. Nora looked at the card, looked at him, looked at the card again. "I have the right station," she said. It was not quite a question. "That depends on what you were expecting," the man said, and turned toward a wagon without explaining anything further. She stood on the platform with her valise and her small leather notebook tucked under her arm and watched him walk away. Around her, the town of Red Rock resolved itself into its modest details. A grain store, a saloon, a church with one of its shutters hanging crooked. A street that the April wind was doing its best to relocate entirely. She had traveled 2,000 miles and there was nowhere to go but forward. This was, she supposed, the point. She picked up her valise and followed him. His name was Augustus Briggs. He delivered this information on the wagon bench without looking at her, the same way a man might note that the temperature had dropped or that there was weather coming in from the north. Father of Colt, owner of the ranch, the one who had placed the advertisement, a fact he also delivered without apology because it did not appear to have occurred to him that one was warranted. Nora wrote in her notebook while the wagon moved A. Briggs placed advertisement. Son did not. Reason unclear. Note does not explain himself. Believes explanation is unnecessary. Then she tucked the notebook away and watched Montana open up around her, which was its own kind of explanation for why a person might learn to believe that. She had been keeping that notebook for 4 years. It had started as a professional habit. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a shipping firm in Boston before Cornelius Whitfield had hired her, and bookkeepers wrote things down. That was the whole point of them, but it had become something else over time. A way of thinking. A way of holding on to what she knew when everything around her was trying to make her doubt it. Small notations, observations, things that didn't add up recorded in a shorthand of her own invention that no one else could read. It was that notebook more than anything else that had gotten her into this situation, though she hadn't understood that yet. Boston, 2 years earlier. The Whitfield import office occupied the top floor of a building on Federal Street that smelled of old wood and newer money, and Cornelius Whitfield occupied the office the way a man occupies something he has recently acquired and is not yet comfortable with too much furniture, placed too deliberately, each piece saying the same thing about its owner, in a slightly different voice. Nora had been hired to manage accounts receivable. She was good at it. She was better at it than the previous bookkeeper and better at it than Whitfield himself suspected, which turned out to be the problem. A bookkeeper's entire value lies in her accuracy. She finds what's there. She records what's missing. She follows numbers the way a tracker follows prints, not because she is suspicious by nature, but because the whole point of the exercise is that the truth has to go somewhere, and numbers are where it goes. The discrepancies had started small. A rounding error on a payment to the harbor authorities that was 23 cents more than it should have been. A supply invoice where the quantity recorded didn't match the quantity in the storeroom. Nothing that anyone would notice if they weren't already in the habit of noticing. Nora noticed. She wrote it down. She kept writing it down for 3 months, building a record in her private shorthand, while she continued to do her job and say nothing, because she had learned early that the moment you said something was the moment you lost control of what happened next. A bookkeeper who talks too soon is just a person making an accusation. A bookkeeper who waits has evidence. She was building evidence. That was all. She did not know at the time that someone else was also watching. Watching her watch the numbers, waiting to see how much she had understood, and calculating what the most efficient way to make her disappear might be. The night she came back to her boarding house and found a newspaper on her table. A newspaper she had not purchased from a city she had not been to. She did not think about who had put it there. She was too tired. She picked it up, saw it was from Helena, Montana, and was about to set it aside when the page fell open to a section of advertisements, and a line of text circled in red pencil stopped her eye. Wanted educated woman of good character, 20 to 25 years. Colt Briggs, proprietor, Briggs Ranch, Red Rock County, Montana Territory. She read it once, read it again. Then she looked up at the room she had lived in for 2 years. The narrow window, the basin with the chipped edge. The chair she had repaired herself, because the landlady charged extra for repairs and did something she did not often permit herself to do. She thought about what was coming, the accusation being prepared against her, the fact that she had no one in this city who would stand up and say she wasn't capable of theft because she had been so careful, so professional, so thoroughly self-contained, that she had accidentally made herself into a person with no witnesses. She thought about the notebook in her valise and the evidence she'd spent 3 months building that would mean nothing in a Boston courtroom because Cornelius Whitfield had friends in Boston courtrooms and she did not. She thought about Montana. Then she started packing. She told herself it was a decision. She would spend the next 2 years believing that. Briggs Ranch appeared on the horizon the way powerful things often appear gradually, then all at once. From a distance, it looked like a working operation, the main house solid and three-storied. The barns large enough to mean business, the pastures rolling out to the east in that particular shade of green that April gives to Montana before the summer burns it back to gold. Up close, it looked like the same thing, only you could see the details that the distance had been kind enough to conceal. The paint on the north face of the main house was beginning to lift at the corners. The gatepost on the left side of the entrance leaned 2 degrees off true. A fence line in the middle distance had 3 rails that didn't match the others in either color or age. Nora wrote in her notebook, "South pasture fence replaced recently, not matching. North face exterior maintenance deferred. Gatepost settling or soft ground. Check." Then she put the notebook away because Augustus Briggs had stopped the wagon and was looking at her. "You write everything down," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than seemed necessary, then stepped down from the wagon. He did not offer her his hand. She did not wait for it. She had just set her valise on the ground when she became aware of being watched from the other direction. She turned. The man standing at the corner of the barn had the kind of stillness that isn't absence of movement, but something more deliberate. The stillness of a person who has been watching long enough to have already decided most of what he thinks and is waiting to see if the remaining question resolves itself one way or the other. He was lean in the way that outdoor work makes a person lean, and there was a scar along his left jawline that hadn't been set quite right when it healed, which told her the injury had happened somewhere without a doctor, or in circumstances where waiting for one hadn't been an option. He looked at her. Then he looked at his father. And in the half-second between those 2 glances, Nora read something that she wrote down in her notebook later that night. See Briggs not complicit. Angry. Also ashamed. Not at her at the situation. Note the shame matters more than the anger. Then Colt Briggs turned and walked back into the barn, which was, she supposed, one way to handle an introduction. The dining room of the Briggs main house had been furnished by someone with opinions. Heavy oak table chairs that matched a sideboard with more capacity than a household of 4 required. The dishes were good china, the silverware real. All of it said, "We are people of standing." The cracked plaster in the far corner, which someone had painted over without fully repairing, said something slightly different. Nora sat down at the table and looked at the 3 people across from her and thought, "I have come a very long way to eat dinner with people who do not want me here." Then she thought, "I have eaten dinner in worse company, and at least the food is warm." Augustus sat at the head of the table with the authority of a man who has sat at the head of every table in his life and has stopped noticing that other people might feel differently about the arrangement. Wren Briggs sat to his left, 19 years old, hair the color of dried grass, hands folded in her lap, with the practiced neatness of someone who has learned that keeping still is a form of protection. She had been looking at Nora since the wagon pulled up, not with hostility, but with the particular intensity of a person encountering something they have wanted to see for a long time and are not sure they're allowed to want. Colt sat at his father's right and looked at his plate. I suppose I should introduce myself properly, Nora said, since we seem to have skipped that part. Augustus said, I know everything I need to know about you. That's interesting, Nora said, because I don't know anything about any of you, except your name. She looked at Colt, which was on the advertisement, the one you didn't write. The table went quiet in a way that suggested it had been quiet in exactly this manner before. Not the quiet of a peaceful house, but the quiet of a house that has learned to absorb things without reaction. The way wood absorbs water slowly and without comment until it starts to warp. Colt looked up. For the first time, he looked at her directly. I didn't write it, he said. I know, Nora said. But the woman in the advertisement still came. So I suppose we start from here. No one knew what to say to that. Wren looked at her plate. Augustus looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has encountered something that was not in the plan and is deciding whether to classify it as a problem or a resource. Colt looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then went back to his food. They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that was, if not comfortable, at least negotiated. The house at night had its own vocabulary. Nora lay in the room they had given her, larger than her Boston room. Cold to the window, looking out over a pasture that the moon was doing its best work on, and listened to it. The creak of the second step from the top of the staircase, which meant someone moving quietly, who knew the step was loud. The sound of a door somewhere that wasn't quite latched opening and closing with the draft. The distant noise of the horses, which was not a sound of distress, but just the presence of animals that slept lightly and near. She wrote in her notebook by lamplight, Day 1. Main house, 3 floors, 4 bedrooms in use, at least 2 closed. Furnishings suggest prosperity from 15 to 20 years ago, less maintained since. Fence repairs inconsistent, some recent, some deferred. Impression the place is being held, not grown. Someone is keeping it from falling without adding to it. Note determine who. Not A. Briggs' wrong kind of attention. Not staff, not their call. C. Briggs possible. She wrote, no one here seems happy. But none of them seemed surprised by that. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, Find the books. She found them on the 3rd day, which was 2 days longer than she would have needed if Silas Dunmore had not been positioned between her and the ranch office like a man who had been stationed there for exactly that purpose. He was polite about it. He was a polite man, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing the same job long enough that it required very little conscious thought. But politeness can be a wall as effectively as hostility. And his was well constructed. The accounts are Mr. Briggs's business, he said the first time she asked. Which Mr. Briggs? She said. He paused. It was a brief pause, but Nora had spent 4 years learning to read pauses. Senior, he said. I'd like to see them anyway. I'll ask him. He asked. Augustus said yes, which surprised Silas enough that he brought her the ledgers himself, carrying them to the kitchen table where she was sitting with her notebook and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She spent the next 4 hours with those ledgers and her coffee, and a silence she did not break. Ranch accounting, she had found, was not so different from mercantile accounting. Once you understood what the categories meant, hay and feed were like raw materials, cattle were inventory, wages were labor, water rights were a fixed asset that everyone in Montana treated as if they weren't, but that were functionally worth more than the land they ran through. She read the columns the way she always read columns, not looking for anything in particular, just following the numbers wherever they wanted to go. Because numbers always want to go somewhere. And if you let them, they'll take you with them. They took her to a discrepancy in the materials account. It was not large. That was the first thing she noted. Small discrepancies are more interesting than large ones because large ones suggest carelessness and small ones suggest precision. Someone who knows exactly how much they can take without triggering scrutiny. The amount moved each month from materials to a sub-account labeled contingency was different every time, varying by enough to defeat any attempt at pattern recognition. If you were only looking at individual months, but when you added them across the year, and then across the 4 years of ledgers, she was looking at the number that emerged was not small at all. She wrote it down, checked it twice, wrote it again. Then she sat with her cold coffee and thought about what she was going to do with it. In Boston, she had waited. She had built her record carefully, patiently, 3 months of documentation before she planned to say a word. And then someone had moved first, and all that careful documentation had become useless because she had no stand-in to use it. She was not going to make that mistake again. She found Augustus in the south pasture just before sundown, standing at a fence line with the look of a man inspecting something that used to be his and is now only adjacent to being his. The light was going amber and long, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched out ahead of him like a row of dark hands pointing west. "There is a recurring discrepancy in your materials account," she said. 4 years, varying amounts running through a sub-account marked contingency. Totaled across the period, someone has moved a significant sum to a destination your ledgers don't explain. He didn't turn around. How significant? She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of confirmation. "And you found this how quickly?" 4 hours. "Silas has been looking at those books for 2 years. Silas is good at running a ranch," Nora said. "He was looking for ranch problems. This isn't a ranch problem." Now Augustus turned. In the amber light, his face was harder to read than usual, all shadow and angle. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a fence he was deciding whether to repair or replace, assessing the structure, determining whether the foundation was sound. "The money is going to Harlan Voss," he said. It came out flat the way statements come out flat when a person has been carrying them too long to give them inflection. "Or to someone in his operation. He has a man in my accounting. Has had one for some time." Nora processed this. "You've known." "I've suspected. There's a difference. Now you have numbers." "Now I have numbers," Augustus agreed. He looked back at the fence line. "Judge Voss has been building a case against this ranch for 3 years. Water rights dispute. He's claimed that my original filing on the Red Rock Creek diversion was fraudulent. If he wins in court, he takes the water. Without the water, the southern pastures can't support a third of the cattle we run. Without that, the ranch is worth a fraction of what it is now. And the money going to his account demonstrates that he has a financial interest in the outcome of a case he'll be hearing, which is not in itself illegal under current territorial law. He paused. But it is the kind of thing that a federal judge might find interesting. Nora looked at him. He was a man who had just told her something he hadn't told anyone else. And he had done it with the economy of someone who doesn't enjoy explaining himself and doesn't intend to make a habit of it. She had the odd sensation of being passed something heavy without being asked if she wanted to hold it. "What do you want me to do with what I've found?" she said. "Document it properly. Your way." He glanced at the notebook she was holding. "Whatever that is." And then he started walking back toward the house. "And then we'll see what it's worth." She found Colt that evening not because she was looking for him, but because there are only so many places a person can be in a house that size, and he had apparently decided the one farthest from his father. And the nearest to the outdoors was the back porch, where he was sitting on the railing with his boots hooked over the lower bar, and a posture that suggested he was considering jumping the fence and just heading north until Montana ran out of things to disappoint him. He didn't look at her when she came out. She leaned against the door frame and looked at the dark pasture for a moment, because some conversations need to be approached from an angle. "How long have you known about Voss and the water rights?" she asked. "Since the first notice arrived, 3 years ago. And the money in the accounts." Now he looked at her. "You found that already." "I find things," she said. "It's what I do." He was quiet for a moment. There was something he was deciding she could see it. The same subtle recalibration she had watched him perform at the dinner table. The weighing of what to say against what it would cost to say it. "My father knows about the money," he said finally. "He's known longer than he told you." "I gathered that. He doesn't share information until he's decided how to use it." "I gathered that too." She looked at the pasture. "He shares it when he needs something he doesn't have. He needed my numbers." Colt said nothing. He was looking at the dark again, that northward look, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was less like a man contemplating escape and more like a man who has been alone in a room for a long time and is surprised to find that someone has walked in and not made it worse. "Why did you come here?" he said. It was the right question. She had expected it eventually. She had an answer ready. She had prepared several in the order of their usefulness. But something about the directness of it, the lack of preamble, made her set the prepared answers aside. "I needed to go somewhere that wasn't Boston," she said. "The advertisement was on my table when I got home one night. I read it. I packed." That's not much of a reason. It was enough of one at the time. He turned to look at her properly. In the dark, with just the light from the windows falling across half his face, the scar on his jaw was more visible. She had looked up what kind of injury left that particular mark the night she had written her notebook entry about him, and concluded that it had been made by something that came at him fast from the left. which meant he had seen it coming and not been able to do anything about it. "I didn't write that advertisement," he said again. "I know. I want you to understand that. It wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't come out here to be handled like that. Like a piece of equipment my father ordered." Nora looked at him. There was something in his voice that she hadn't expected. Not apology, because he hadn't done anything to apologize for, but something adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of a person who finds themselves adjacent to a wrong they didn't commit and can't entirely separate themselves from. "No," she said. "I didn't. But I'm here now, and here is where the work is so." She pushed off from the doorframe. "I'm going to document the discrepancies in your accounts. If your father wants to use what I find, that's his decision. But I want you to know, I'm doing it whether he decides to use it or not, because it's what I can do, and it needs doing." "Why tell me that?" "Because you're the one who actually runs this ranch," she said. "Your father owns it. You run it. Which means eventually you're going to be the one who has to deal with whatever happens next." She went back inside. Behind her, she heard Colt Briggs shift on the railing, and then the quiet that followed had a different quality than the one before. Less like a man waiting for something to end, and more like a man who has just been handed an unexpected piece of information and is holding it carefully, checking its weight. In Boston, the summer before she left, Nora had a habit of eating her lunch on the steps of the custom house when the weather allowed it, because the steps faced south and caught the light in a way that her office window did not. And there were a few minutes every afternoon when the city did something with that light that she found difficult to explain, but had become, without her entirely intending it, something she looked forward to. She had given up a great deal to be good at her work. Not deliberately, she had never made a formal accounting of it. But when she looked back across her 20s, which at 21 she was technically not yet old enough to look back across with any authority, she could see the shape of what she had traded away. The evening invitations she had declined because she had figures to finish. The friendships that had thinned to acquaintanceships because she had been too tired or too distracted or too carefully self-contained to maintain them. The particular loneliness of a person who is good at something solitary and has organized her life around that goodness until the life and the work are the same shape, and there is no space left between them for anything else to grow. She had not thought of this as a problem. She had thought of it as efficiency. The custom house steps had been perhaps the one inefficiency she had allowed herself. 10 minutes every afternoon. Sunlight and the smell of the harbor, and the noise of the city doing its ordinary business around her. She had not written anything in her notebook during those 10 minutes. She had just sat there, She thought about those steps sometimes in Montana in the way that you think about small things that were good when you are too far away to go back to them. The house on a Thursday night in the first week of May. Nora was coming up the main stairs heading to her room with the account ledgers tucked under her arm and 3 pages of notes in her notebook, when she became aware of something she hadn't noticed before. At the end of the second-floor hallway, past the last bedroom door and around a narrow turn that the main hall didn't quite suggest was there, There was another door, smaller than the others, set back slightly as though the person who built the house had included it as an afterthought or a concession to some need that the house's main design hadn't accounted for. She would not have noticed it at all, except that the hallway, which in the evenings was lit by a single lamp at the near end, was dark enough at the far end that the thin line of not quite darkness beneath that door was visible. Not light exactly. Something older than light. Like the memory of light or the absence of the particular darkness that occupied the rest of the hall. She stood at the turn of the hallway for a moment, feeling slightly foolish, and then went to bed. The next morning, she came down early enough to catch Mrs. Aldous before breakfast. The housekeeper was a contained woman of 62, who had been with the Briggs household for as long as anyone mentioned, and who performed her function with the systematic thoroughness of someone who long ago decided that the best way to survive in a difficult house was to become indispensable to its operation and invisible to its occupants. She had treated Nora since the first day with a precise and undemonstrative neutrality, not unkind, not warm, occupying the exact middle of those two things with the care of a person who has learned that warmth is a commitment and coldness is a provocation, and neither is safe. That morning, Mrs. Aldous was moving through the front hallway with her ring of keys in one hand and a purpose in the other, and one of the keys caught on the loop and fell to the floor and landed at Nora's feet. Nora picked it up. Mrs. Aldous held out her hand. Then she paused fractionally in the way that a breath pauses at the top of an inhale before the exhale comes. Her hand stayed out, but her eyes went for just a moment to the far end of the hall and back. Nora looked at the key in her hand. It was older than the others on the ring. Different metal, smaller head. The kind of key made for a door that was not designed to be opened often. "Thank you," Mrs. Aldous said, and took it back. But Nora had already looked at it long enough to know its weight and its shape, and that night she wrote in her notebook, "There is something behind the door at the end of the second-floor hallway. Mrs. A knows what it is. She is not hiding it so much as waiting for something. Determine what she is waiting for." That same evening, Wren Briggs found Nora on the front porch. She didn't announce herself. She was one of those people who move quietly, not from stealth, but from long practice at not attracting attention. And she settled into the chair beside Nora's with the economy of someone who is uncertain of their welcome and has decided to take up as little space as possible while they find out. The sun was going down over the western range and doing it extravagantly the way Montana sunsets did. A show put on for no particular audience, simply because the sky had the materials and the inclination. "You're not what I expected," Wren said. Not an accusation. An observation. "What did you expect?" Wren considered. "Someone more frightened," she said. "Or more performing. The not frightened part. There's a difference between not performing it and not feeling it," Nora said. "Are you frightened?" "Every day," Nora said. "I've just had a lot of practice continuing regardless." Wren was quiet for a moment. "Our mother came here the same way," she said. "Answered an advertisement. My father placed it in 1861. She was from Pennsylvania. She didn't know anyone west of the Ohio River. Nora looked at her. Father says she died of fever, Wren said. In 1879. I was 9. She paused. Colt was 15. He never says she died of fever. Nora absorbed this. She thought about how carefully to move in a conversation like this one, where the information being offered was also being tested. The teller watching to see whether the receiver was someone who could be trusted with the weight of it. What does Colt say? She asked. He doesn't say anything, Wren said. That's the thing. He just goes quiet the way he goes quiet when someone says something that isn't true. And he's decided not to fight it. She looked at the darkening western sky. I've been watching him go quiet for 10 years. And I still don't know what he knows. Do you want to? A longer pause. I think I have to, Wren said. I think not knowing has been making me smaller, like a room that no one opens. Things go stale in rooms no one opens. Nora thought about a door at the end of a hallway, a key on a housekeeper's ring. Your mother's room, she said carefully. Is it still? Behind the back staircase, Wren said. Father had it closed up after she died. Mrs. Aldouse keeps it. She looked at Nora sideways. I went in once. I was 16. I haven't been back. They sat with that for a while. The last of the sunset went out. The first stars came in from the east with the practical efficiency of things that do not require permission to exist. She came out here like you did, Wren said. A stranger in someone else's house, trying to figure out the rules. She turned to look at Nora directly for the first time since she'd sat down. I wanted you to know that I know that. What it is to be that. Nora did not say anything because sometimes there isn't anything to say that doesn't diminish what was said before it. After a while, Wren stood and went back inside. Nora stayed on the porch. She opened her notebook and held it in the dim light from the window, and added a line to the entry she'd written about the locked door. Wren Briggs knows more than she lets on. She is not hiding it to protect anyone. She is hiding it because she doesn't yet know how to carry it. Note, this matters. She closed the notebook. In the house behind her, she could hear the sound of someone descending the main staircase. A heavy, deliberate tread, each step taken with intention. And then the quiet of a house that had been holding too much for too long, and had not yet found anyone patient enough to help it set it down. That Nora thought was something she might be able to something about. She was not sure yet, but she had come 2,000 miles on less certainty than this, and the mathematics of her situation had not substantially changed. There was nowhere to go. But forward and forward was the only direction that had ever in her experience been worth the trouble. She stayed on the porch until the cold came in off the mountains. Then she went inside and went to work. The notice came on a Tuesday. Silas Dunmore delivered it himself, which she respected, because the alternative was to have Mrs. Aldous leave it somewhere Nora would find it later. And that would have been the coward's way. And Silas was not a coward. He was a man who did difficult things directly and without ceremony, which was why he was good at running a ranch and not always easy to be around. And he appeared in the doorway of the kitchen where Nora was eating breakfast and said what he had come to say. "Mr. Briggs asked me to tell you the ledger access is suspended for the time being." Nora set down her coffee cup. "Which Mr. Briggs?" A pause that answered the question without answering it. "I see," she said. Silas stood there for a moment in the way of a man who has delivered the message and knows it's not a good one, and would like to say something further but has not yet located what that something is. He was not unsympathetic, she could see that. He was a man trying to do his job inside a situation that his job did not technically include. "You found something in those books," he said finally. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. "I find things," she said. "It's what I do." He nodded, turned to go, then stopped. "Whatever you found," he said with his back to her, "you weren't wrong about it." He left before she could respond. She sat with her coffee until it was cold again, which happened a great deal in this house. Then she opened her notebook and wrote Day 14. Ledger access suspended following report to A. Briggs. Analysis either protecting Voss or protecting himself or not ready to act. Note Whitfield also moved this way. Week 3. The pattern has a name. It's called making yourself the only person who can decide when to use the information you've just been given. She underlined the last sentence, then added difference. Whitfield kept moving. "So will I." She folded the notebook shut, put it in her pocket, and went to the kitchen. She opened the second drawer from the left, the one she had seen Mrs. Aldous open, without apparent reason on her second morning here, and the key was inside it, resting on a folded cloth as though it had been waiting. She closed her hand around it and went upstairs. The door at the end of the second-floor hallway opened without resistance, which surprised her. She had expected something, a warped frame rust in the mechanism. The physical record of years closed against entry. Instead, it swung inward on hinges that had been oiled more recently than the rest of the door suggested, as though someone had been maintaining the possibility of this moment without being willing to bring it about themselves. The room was small and east-facing. The morning light came in through a window that had not been opened in some time, but had been cleaned the glass thin with the kind of clarity that only happens when someone wipes it regularly and with care. Below the window, a writing desk. Beside it, a narrow shelf with 4 books on it. Not decorative, all 4 visibly read the spines bent in the way of books that have been picked up and set down many times. On the wall, a piece of embroidery in a plain frame, a pattern of small leaves finished except for a section in the lower right corner, where the thread stopped mid-stitch, as though the maker had set it down to attend to something and simply not returned. There was a cloth draped over the desk. Nora lifted it. The desk surface held a small cedar box, a dried bundle of lavender tied with string now gone brittle, and a book bound in brown leather with a cord of copper wire around it, in the manner of someone who wants something closed but knows that locks can be defeated. and has decided that the real seal is in the unwillingness to violate a private thing. On the cover in ink that had faded to the color of old tea, Margaret Elaine Briggs, 1861. Nora unwound the cord, sat down in the chair that was the only chair in the room, and began to read. What she had expected, she realized later, was grief. The private record of a woman who had come west as a stranger and found herself in a hard marriage in a hard place, and had written down her sorrows in the way that people write down their sorrows when there is no one to tell them to. What she found instead was a ledger. Not in form, the pages were ordinary journal pages dated at the top, written in a hand that was careful at first and became more economical as the years went on, as though the writer had gradually stopped being concerned with the appearance of the thing and started being concerned only with its use. But in function in the deliberate architecture of the information recorded in the way Margaret Briggs had organized what she knew, and cross-referenced it and noted what required verification and what could be stated as settled fact. It was unmistakably the work of someone who had understood from an early point that what she was building was a case. She had noted dates and names. The Reed family land adjacent to the southern boundary transferred to Briggs' ownership in 1866 through paperwork that Margaret had seen, and that she described in 3 careful sentences as inconsistent with any document she had previously encountered at a county office. The Mallory Water Agreement signed in 1870 1, which Margaret had compared against the original filed copy at the territorial office and found to differ in 2 specific clauses. A judge in Denver named Archibald Sutter, whose rulings in land disputes had aligned with Briggs' interests in 7 consecutive cases between 1868 and 1875, and beside whose name Margaret had written in smaller letters, "Ask who pays his rent." She had been systematic. She had been patient. She had been building something that, if she had been able to finish it, might have been enough. In the margins of certain entries, she had written notes to herself that were the closest thing to private feeling the journal contained. Beside one early entry about the Reed land, he did not do this because he had to. He did it because he could. I think that is the thing I am still learning to understand about him. Beside a later entry about the Denver judge, I am not writing this out of anger. I am past anger. I am writing this because someone should know. And if not me, then no one. Nora read for 2 hours without moving. Outside the ranch conducted its mourning. She could hear it distantly, the noise of cattle being moved. Someone hammering something near the east barn, the slow back and forth of a saw. The ordinary sounds of a working operation that had no idea it was sitting on top of an archive. She was 3/4 through the journal when she found the entry that changed its register. He knows I am writing this. He has not said so, but I see it in the way he looks at me when I come out of this room, a particular attention that is different from his usual kind. His usual attention is for things he is deciding whether he can use. This is the attention of a man deciding whether something is going to become a problem. Nora held the page. I find I am not afraid of the idea that he might act on it. What I am afraid of is something stranger that he won't, that he will simply continue as he is. And so will I, and this room and what I have put into this journal will be the only record that any of this was ever wrong. That seems worse to me than the alternative. I don't entirely understand why. Several pages later, the handwriting changed. It was subtle at first, a slight increase in the space between words, as though the hand that had always been precise was now being asked to be precise under some additional difficulty. Then less subtle. The letters becoming larger and less even, the pressure of the pen inconsistent in a way that suggested the hand holding it was no longer quite steady. I have been ill for 12 days. It started the night after I told him I had been in correspondence with a solicitor in Denver. I have not been well enough to leave this room. He brings the meals himself. He is very attentive. Below that, 2 lines written carefully as though each word had been considered before being committed to the page. If anyone reads this after me, I am not a woman who frightens easily. I want that recorded. Then nothing. The next page was blank. Every page after it was blank. Nora sat with the journal closed in her lap and the morning light moving across the floor as the sun shifted, and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Some facts don't require commentary. They require only to be known. She turned to the final written page. Below Margaret's last line at the very bottom of the page, there was something she had not noticed before. A second signature written in different ink, blacker, newer, the hand of a man with a date beneath it. A B 1882. Augustus Briggs had signed his name in his dead wife's journal 3 years after she died. Not on the front page, not at the beginning. At the end, below the last words she had written. Nora looked at that signature for a long time. Then she turned to the back of the journal, to the final page, the one she had saved. She had noticed earlier that the preceding page had a small irregularity at its lower edge, a faint line barely visible where something had once been attached. Not torn roughly, cut or pulled carefully at a seam in the way of a person who wanted the removal to look like absence rather than deletion. Someone had taken the last page. Cornelius Whitfield had an explanation for everything. That was, she had come to understand the actual nature of his talent. Not the trading, not the contacts, not the ability to move goods between continents with minimum friction. Those were skills any competent man in his position could have acquired. What Whitfield had that was rare was the capacity to look at a fact that contradicted his interests and immediately, without visible effort, produce an explanation for it that reframed the fact as something benign. She had watched him do this for 2 years without fully naming what she was watching. The first time a discrepancy appeared in the accounts she was managing. He explained it as a currency conversion error from a London correspondent who used different rounding methods. She had checked. The explanation was technically plausible. She had filed it away and said nothing. The second time, a larger sum, he explained it as a prepayment toward a future contract that had not yet been formally recorded. She had looked for the contract. She had not found it. She had not said so. By the time she had identified the pattern. Not errors, not anomalies, but a system. a very deliberate and practiced system for moving money to a destination. The official books did not acknowledge she had also, without entirely intending to assemble a significant record in her notebook, written in a shorthand she had developed precisely because she had learned early that things written plainly can be read by anyone, and things written in a private language cannot be used against the person who wrote them. She had not yet understood who she was building the record against. She had thought of it as building it for the moment when she would know enough to know what to do next. On the last day she spent in that office, Whitfield called her in to discuss what he described as a series of minor anomalies in the accounts she managed. Anomalies she had not introduced that had appeared in the ledgers between Monday and that Thursday morning in handwriting that was not hers. He was very calm about it. His explanations were detailed and specific, and internally consistent. He had clearly prepared them with some care. She sat across from him and listened, and understood with the particular precision of a person who has spent years learning to read things that don't want to be read exactly what was happening, and exactly why there was nothing she could say in that room that would do her any good. That night she found the newspaper. She had thought, sitting in her boarding house with the advertisement circled in red, that she was making a decision. She had thought she was exercising the one piece of agency left available to her in a situation that had otherwise closed around her. She had packed her one good valise and bought her train ticket and told herself she was choosing. The thing about decisions made in extremity is that they feel like freedom because they feel like movement. It is only later, when you have gone far enough to look back, that you can tell the difference between choosing a direction and being pointed at one. She did not know this yet, sitting in her boarding house in Boston with the lamplight on the advertisement. She was not supposed to know it yet. She found Wren in the kitchen that afternoon, sitting at the table with a bowl of flour and a posture that suggested she had been sitting there for a while doing nothing with either. Nora had spent the 2 hours since leaving Margaret's room deciding what to tell people and in what order. The journal was back under the cloth on the desk. The door relocked the key in her pocket. She had her notes. She had her conclusions. She was not yet ready to speak any of it aloud, because speaking things aloud moves them from the category of what you know to the category of what you have said. And the second category has consequences that the first does not. But when she saw Wren's face, the specific quality of stillness in it, the stillness of someone sitting with something heavy and waiting for someone to notice they are sitting with it, she understood that Wren already knew most of what she had spent the morning discovering. "You read it," Nora said. Wren looked at the flower bowl. 3 years ago. "How did you find it, Mrs. Aldous?" A short pause. "She didn't tell me. She just stopped one day in front of that hallway and looked at the door and then looked at me and then looked at the door again. Like she was pointing at something without pointing at it." Wren smoothed the flour in the bowl absently, without purpose. "I found the spare key in the kitchen drawer 2 days later. I think she put it there. Why didn't you say something 3 years ago?" "To who?" Wren said. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. My father, Colt, was already carrying something I didn't understand and couldn't ask about. And what would I have said? She looked at Nora. I was 16 years old. I read something that told me my father had likely killed my mother and written his name at the end of the proof of it, and I had nowhere to put that. Nora sat down across from her. So I closed the room back up, Wren said, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. She picked up a spoon, and then you arrived. You asked Mrs. Aldous to drop the key last week, when I understood you were the kind of person who would know what to do with what's in there. She looked at the flower. I couldn't open that door again myself. It seemed like something I wasn't supposed to do alone. But I thought maybe. She stopped, began again. I thought maybe with someone else there to receive it, it would be all right. Nora thought about a woman in a Boston boarding house who had also been waiting without knowing what she was waiting for, and who had also received something she had not understood, was being deliberately handed to her. "Show me how your mother made the bread," Nora said. Wren looked up. "You mentioned she had a recipe," Nora said. "The one you remember." It took a moment. Then Wren's hands moved and she began. It was a simple recipe, the kind that predates written instructions, and exists only in the sequence of gestures, the amount of flour that looks right before you begin to add anything else. The particular motion of working fat into the dry ingredients that has to be done by feel rather than measurement. Wren talked while she worked, not in the voice she used for careful conversation, but in a lower register, the voice of someone accessing something that lives below the part of the mind that monitors what it says. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing the long slanted thing it did in May, filling the room at an angle that made everything inside it look slightly more permanent than it was. "I don't know how much I know," Wren said without looking up. "About what you found. About what it means." A pause, her hands still moving. "I know enough to understand that things are going to change, and I wanted you to know before they do that I'm with you, whichever way it goes." Nora watched her hands, thought about Margaret Briggs, who had also had a kitchen, who had also known things that had no one to receive them, who had written, if not me, then no one, and had been for 10 years right. "I know," Nora said. "They stayed in the kitchen until the bread was in the oven, and then they stayed a little longer and no one came to find them. And for a short while the house was just a house." He arrived the following morning, a man on a well-maintained dun horse coming up the approach road from the south, at the pace of someone who has been riding a long way and is not in a hurry because hurrying stopped being useful several hours ago. He carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have been outdoors long enough that the outdoors has become their natural state. No adjustment, no accommodation to the fact of other people watching, just the direct economy of a person going where he's going. Silas met him at the gate. Nora watched from the kitchen window because the kitchen window had become, over the course of her first weeks at Briggs Ranch, her primary instrument of orientation, the thing she stood at in the mornings to take inventory of the day before the day took inventory of her. The man spoke to Silas for a short time. Silas looked at the main house once, a quick look. the kind that contains a whole calculation. Then he extended his hand and the man shook it, and they walked toward the barn together. 10 minutes later, Colt came out of the barn, shook the man's hand in the brief way he shook most things, and went back to what he'd been doing. The man was given a stall for his horse and apparently the agreement to stay for some time in the capacity of a cattle buyer from Cheyenne interested in early season prices. His name was Fletcher Reed. She knew this because Silas mentioned it at midday, passing through the kitchen, in the way that people in working households pass through kitchens briefly and with purpose. And she had asked in the way she asked most things without inflection, as though the answer was incidental rather than the whole point of the question. She did not know at that moment anything else about him. She had never heard the name. She would not connect it to anything she knew until later. What she knew when he came through the kitchen door with Silas to collect lunch was that when he turned and saw her standing at the counter with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, something crossed his face that was gone before she could name it. A fraction of a second's disruption in the practiced ease of a man who was very good at not showing what he was thinking. It was the same kind of disruption she had felt looking at him. The same quality of recognition trying to assemble itself around a face she had seen once, briefly in a different city, in a different life. She went back to her notes. He poured his coffee. Neither of them said anything. The thing about working from evidence is that you learn to wait. You do not reach for a conclusion until you have enough material to reach for it properly. She had spent 4 years building that habit, and she applied it. Now she let what she had seen sit in the back of her mind where it could work without being disturbed. And she went about the rest of the day. There is a particular quality of late afternoon in a barn. The light comes in through the high vents at a downward angle, picking up the dust of hay and the warmth of animals softening everything. It touches into the color of old gold. It is a light that makes people say things they might not say in a kitchen or on a porch, because there is something about its combination of intimacy and openness that reduces the cost of honesty. She found Fletcher Reed in the third stall from the back, checking his horse's left foreleg, with the quiet attention of someone who does this, not because he has been told to, but because it is the kind of thing he does automatically, the same way Nora opened her notebook. "You were in Boston," she said. He didn't stop what he was doing. "So were you." Whitfield's office, Federal Street. She stayed by the stall door. "You came in on a Thursday in November of 1887. I was at the desk at the end of the hall. You looked at me for about 3 seconds and then looked away." Now he stood. He was taller than he had seemed on horseback, several inches over 6 feet, which in a hay-dusted barn with a low ceiling creates a particular kind of presence. His expression was not what she had expected. She had half anticipated deflection, or at least the performance of surprise. What she got instead was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is relieved in the particular, exhausting way of relief, after sustained effort to be able to set it down. "I was there to look at him," Fletcher said. "Not you. I didn't know you then." A pause. "I know more about you now." "Then you have the advantage," Nora said. Fix that, he told her. His father's name had been Elias Reed. He had owned 340 acres south of the Red Rock Creek that he had homesteaded in 1863 and worked for the following 3 years until a series of legal challenges backed by paperwork that Elias had never been able to contest successfully, because the courts where he filed his challenges were run by men who had already decided their outcomes stripped the claim from him. He had moved his family to Wyoming. He had worked other men's land for the rest of his life. He had died at 51 in a way that a doctor would have called heart failure, and that Fletcher, who had been 13 at the time and watching closely, would have called something else. Fletcher's mother had taught him 2 things before she died. The first was that you don't fight a system with a gun because the system will always have more guns. The second was that a system built on paperwork can be fought with better paperwork. And she had died believing that the proof was there to be assembled by someone patient enough to assemble it. He had been assembling it for 8 years. He had the Mallory agreement discrepancy. He had records from 4 other families displaced in similar ways going back to the early 1860s. He had a paper trail that connected Harlan Voss to a pattern of rulings that could not, if examined by a federal judge, with no local interests, be explained as coincidence. He had almost enough. What he was missing was documentation from inside the operation itself, something that could speak to the originating intent, rather than just the resulting facts. "And then I heard there was a new woman at Briggs Ranch," Fletcher said, "a bookkeeper from Boston who had worked for Cornelius Whitfield." Nora absorbed this. Whitfield is connected to Voss. They're cousins. Have been in correspondence since at least 1881. Fletcher looked at her steadily. "I went to Boston to find out what Whitfield knew about the Voss operation. I ended up learning what he was doing in his own right. I didn't make the connection to you until I heard you'd arrived here." "How did you hear that?" "I've been watching this ranch for 2 years from a distance." He said it simply without apology. "I have a contact in Red Rock who sends word when anything changes." A pause. "Your arrival was a significant change." Nora stood with this. She was already moving through the implications in the part of her mind that ran parallel to conversation, the part that kept the ledger while the surface attended to other things. Whitfield and Voss. Boston and Montana. The advertisement that had appeared on her table. The fact that she had never in 2 years at the federal street office received a Montana newspaper. The fact that someone had known where her room was. "He wanted me gone from Boston," she said. She was not asking. She was checking the math. "He knew you had records he couldn't get to. In that notebook you're carrying." Fletcher glanced at her pocket. "He couldn't take it from you without drawing attention. Couldn't make the charges stick quickly enough once you left. So the most efficient solution was to make Boston untenable and point you toward a place where, if you caused trouble, you'd be causing trouble for someone he wanted troubled." A pause. A woman with no standing in Montana territory, no connections, recently arrived under circumstances that could easily be made to look opportunistic. If anything she said or found damaged the Voss operation, Voss's legal team could discredit her before she got 2 words into a courtroom. "I was meant to be a disturbance," Nora said. "Something that created noise inside this ranch. Made it easier for Voss to argue instability. That's what he planned for." He assumed I would fail. He assumed you wouldn't know enough to do anything else. The barn light was moving, going amber, the hour tipping toward evening. Nora thought about a pattern in an accounting ledger that she had noticed, because she always noticed what other people were not looking for, and about a woman in a room at the end of a second-floor hallway who had also noticed 20 years before her and had also built her evidence carefully and had not finished. "I have the journal," she said. Fletcher went still. Margaret Briggs, her documentation of the land acquisitions, the fraudulent filings, the connection to Voss. She held his eyes. She was building the same thing you're building from the inside. She was going to contact a solicitor in Denver. A pause. She didn't get the chance. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the careful silence of two strangers taking each other's measure, but something heavier. The silence of two people who have just realized they are carrying different pieces of the same thing. "How complete is it?" Fletcher's voice was level but barely. "Complete enough. With yours." He let out a slow breath. It was, she thought, the first thing he had done that showed the weight of 8 years. The door to the barn opened. Colt stood in the frame with the last of the outside light at his back. He took in the scene the way Colt Briggs took in most things, without expression, with attention moving through the available information at a speed that looked unhurried and wasn't. His eyes went to Fletcher. Fletcher Reed. Not a question, not a greeting exactly. The saying of a name that has been held in a certain place for a long time. "You know who I am," Fletcher said. "My father talked about your family." A pause with something specific in it, not hostility but acknowledgement. The particular tone of a man confronting a fact he has known about for a while and is now standing in front of directly. "He talked about a lot of families." "I know he did." Colt looked at Nora. There was something in his face that she had not seen before. Not surprise, but a kind of tired resolve. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and is now seeing it in the doorway. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." He came the rest of the way into the barn. He stood for a moment in the changed light, looking at nothing in particular. And Nora could see him making the decision she had watched him make at the dinner table and on the porch, and in every small exchange they'd had since she arrived. The decision of what to say versus what it would cost. This time he paid. He told them what he had heard on the night of the last argument between his parents. He told it without elaboration. Just the facts of it, the way she told facts. The structure of what happened when, including the fact of his own age, 15. The fact that he'd had nothing but a memory of a voice through a door. He told them about the weeks that followed the slow alteration of his mother, the particular efficiency with which his father had attended to her. He told them that he had gone looking for the journal 2 years after she died, and found it and read the last page, and understood what was in it, and what would happen to the person who put it forward with no proof behind it, but a boy's memory of a voice through a closed door. "I took the last page," he said. because she had written my name on it. She knew I had heard. She wrote that she hoped. He stopped. It doesn't matter what she hoped. I was 17. I thought I was protecting something. What were you protecting? Nora asked. The answer took a while. I don't know anymore. Maybe just the ability to stay in the house without my father knowing what I knew. He looked at the floor. Maybe nothing worth protecting. Nora turned to the last written page in her memory, to the second signature at the bottom of it. The ink blacker than everything else in that journal. He read it too, she said. Your father. After she died. His signature is on the last page. Colt looked up. 1882, she said. 3 years after. Something moved through his face. Not one thing, but several at once in a sequence she could not entirely read. Grief and anger and something underneath both of them that was quieter and worse. The particular anguish of a man discovering that someone he has spent years fearing also loved the thing he lost. Neither she nor Fletcher spoke. He kept it, Colt said finally. It came out with a quality she hadn't heard in his voice before. Not broken, but stripped of the economy he normally maintained. He read it and he kept it. Yes, Nora said. The barn held the three of them for a moment. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch moved on as they always did, the indifferent continuation of a working place that does not adjust its schedule for what happens in its interiors. Now we have everything, Fletcher said quietly. Your mother's documentation, my records, the connection to Voss. And mine, Nora said. In Boston. 3 separate threads. Fletcher looked at Colt. A federal filing would survive a challenge from Voss's legal operation. A state filing wouldn't, not in this county. But 3 sets of records from 3 independent sources filed at the federal level. My father is dying, Colt said. He has a year, maybe less. A flat statement delivered without sentiment. That changes the calculation on his end. It changes it on all ends, Nora said. They stood in the barn while the light finished going. At some point, without anyone deciding to, they began to talk about what came next. She came up to the house later than she had intended, walking through the dark that smelled of turned earth and early grass, and the particular cold of Montana nights that didn't negotiate with the warmth of the day. In the kitchen window, a lamp was still burning. Through the glass, she could see the shape of the bread Wren had made sitting on the counter covered with a cloth. The ordinary proof of an ordinary afternoon that had contained a great deal. That was not ordinary at all. She opened her notebook on the porch step in the last of the lamplight coming through the window and wrote, Day 17. Fletcher Reed, Elias Reed's son, 8 years of documentation, federal case viable with 3 sources. Journal of M. Briggs, investigative record, sufficient detail. Final page removed by C. Briggs, age 17. Signature of A. Briggs on final remaining page, 1882. She stopped writing, looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line. 2 women built the same record 20 years apart. The first one ran out of time. I haven't yet. She closed the notebook. Above the mountains, the stars were doing their nightly business. The same stars that had been there in 1879 when Margaret Briggs wrote her last careful sentences in a room at the end of a hallway, and the same stars that had been there when Elias Reed had worked the land that wasn't his anymore, and the same stars that were here now over a ranch that had been built on all of it. All that damage, all that careful silence. She sat for a while longer. Let the cold come in. Then she went inside. They worked through the early morning in the kitchen, which was the only room in the house where the table was large enough and where no one would find the work unusual. Kitchens were where things got done. Nora had understood this about working households from the time she was old enough to understand anything about them. She laid out what she had. In the order she always laid things out, not chronological but logical, organized by the relationship between pieces, rather than the sequence in which they'd been found. Her notebook opened to the pages where she'd transcribed the material from Margaret's journal in her private shorthand. Fletcher's files, which he'd retrieved from his saddlebag, and which turned out to be considerably more organized than she had expected. Not a single record book, but a series of correspondence packets, each one tied separately, each one labeled with a name. The Mallory Agreement Discrepancy, Original and Copy, showing the altered clauses. Land transfer records from 4 other families, each one documented with the particular care of a man who has been building towards something for 8 years and knows that the work will only get one chance to matter. Colt sat across from her and said very little, which was, she had come to understand how he processed things he could not change by attending closely to things he could. By the time the sun was up enough to need the lamp no longer, they had the shape of it. 3 independent sets of records, Fletcher said. He had his hands around a coffee cup and was looking at the table, rather than either of them, the look of someone running numbers. Filed federally at the level that bypasses the Voss operation entirely. The Whitfield connection makes it relevant to both the Boston charges and the Montana ones. He looked at Nora. What you have in that notebook is the Boston half of a case that Voss's legal team can't dismiss as a local grievance. And my mother's journal, Colt said, is the only evidence that establishes intent from the original acquisitions forward, not just the outcomes. We file together, Nora said. Separately, each record is challengeable. Together, Fletcher said, they're a history. They divided what needed to be done with the practicality of people who have too much to do and too little time for ceremony. Fletcher would prepare a consolidated summary of his 8 years of documentation and have it ready to attach to a filing package. Colt would locate and produce the original Briggs land filings from his father's office, the ones they'd need to argue the Reed claim, and the others. Nora would transcribe the relevant sections of Margaret's journal into a formal record dated and signed that could be presented as evidence without requiring the original document to leave the room where Margaret had written it. She went to work. There had been a winter her second year in Boston when the shipping firm she worked for before Whitfield had closed its Federal Street office in February, and she had spent 3 weeks looking for another position. She had found one eventually. She always found them, because she was good at what she did and people who were good at things found work. But there were 10 days in that 3 weeks when the situation had been genuinely uncertain, when she had sat in her boarding house in the evenings and looked at the numbers of what she had versus what she owed, and understood that the margin between them was narrow enough to see through. She had not been afraid exactly. Fear was a physical thing, a body's response to immediate threat, and she had learned to reserve it for situations that warranted it. What she had felt instead was a particular clarity, a stripping away of everything that wasn't essential, a forced inventory of what she actually required versus what she had only thought she required. She had understood sitting in that room in February that she needed very little: a place to work, something to work toward, the ability to see clearly what was in front of her. What she had not understood then was that the same conditions that made her useful, the economy, the self-containment, the absence of people who would miss her if she left, also made her manageable. You cannot move a person who has things to hold on to. A person who has removed all her holdings is already packed. She understood this now. She understood it in the particular comprehensive way that you understand things you have been positioned to understand all at once. The full shape of it arriving complete, the way a room looks different when someone finally turns on the light. Cornelius Whitfield had not been afraid of her. He had been efficient. He had known she kept records because that was her job, and he had hired her for it. He had known she had found something because she was too careful to behave differently after finding it, which meant the careful behavior itself was information. And he had known that the most effective way to neutralize a person who had documented your crimes was not to destroy the documentation. It was to destroy the person's ability to use it to move her to a place where she had no standing, no connections, no name that meant anything. Montana territory, a mail-order bride. No one to vouch for her, no court that would take her word against a Boston merchant's, no possibility of getting her evidence heard without also being heard herself. And she had nothing in Montana that would make anyone listen. That was the plan. The newspaper with the advertisement had been on her table when she got home. She had not placed it there. She subscribed to 2 Boston papers, neither of which was from Helena. Someone had known where she lived, had known what she needed to hear in order to go, had made sure she heard it at exactly the right moment. She had packed her valise and told herself she was making a decision. The thing that came up in her throat now, sitting in a Montana ranch kitchen, with the evidence of everything spread across the table in front of her, was not grief and was not fear. It was a clean burning anger, specific and thorough, the kind that comes not from being hurt, but from understanding precisely how you were underestimated. He had thought she would be a disturbance, an instrument of someone else's plan, a woman with a notebook full of things she could not use, dropped into the middle of a situation she could not read, expected to create noise and confusion, and ultimately prove nothing that mattered. She sat with that for a moment. Let it be what it was. Then she picked up her pen and kept writing. She went out to the yard in the late afternoon after the transcription was done because she needed to move. The anger was still there. She was not going to pretend it was gone. That was not how she worked. But it had changed its quality slightly, the way fire changes when it's had enough air. less like something happening to her, and more like something she was carrying. The yard was empty in the way working places are empty in the middle of the day when everyone is somewhere with a purpose. The mountains were doing their afternoon thing, the shadows of the western peaks beginning to stretch, and the light had gone to that particular shade that turned the ordinary brown of the ranch buildings into something that looked for a few minutes each day like it had been built intentionally in this specific light. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at nothing, and let herself be angry, which was something she did not usually permit herself because it was not efficient. And efficiency was what she had built herself around. And she recognized now that this right here, this standing in a yard and allowing a feeling to exist without immediately converting it into a plan was something she had not done in years. He had used her, had calculated her situation with the same precision she used on ledgers, had identified the exact pressure point that would move her and had applied it. And the worst part, the part that made the anger clean and specific, was that he had not been wrong about most of it. She had been movable. She had been exactly as isolated as he'd calculated. She had come exactly as far as he'd needed her to come. She had thought of herself for 4 years as a person who saw things clearly. It had been the one claim she made on herself without qualification. Not that she was exceptional. Not that she was more capable than other people, but that she looked at what was actually in front of her, rather than what she wanted to see. She had built an entire way of living around this one thing: the notebook, the shorthand, the habit of recording what she observed before she tried to explain it. And she had been moved across a continent by a man who had read the same qualities in her and seen something different. Then she had not a person who saw clearly, but a person whose clarity could be aimed. He had only been wrong about one thing. She had not known where she was. Now she did. Footsteps crossed the yard behind her. She did not turn. "There's a second bedroom on the north side of the barn," Colt said. "No one uses it. If you need somewhere to go." "I don't need somewhere to go," she said. He stopped a few feet behind her. She could hear him standing there in the particular way he stood. Not restless, not impatiently. Still just present in the manner of a man who has learned that there are situations that require your presence and very little else. "You found out about the newspaper," he said. "Fletcher told me this morning. Do you want to leave?" "I can't leave." She turned. He was looking at her with the direct attention she had noticed in him from the first day, not the attention of someone trying to read her, but of someone who had already decided to be honest about what he saw, whatever it was. "My name is in Whitfield's files as a thief. I have no standing in Boston, and everything I can use to clear myself is tied up in what we're doing here." "That's a reason to stay," Colt said. "I asked if you wanted to." She looked at him. There was a version of this moment where she would have prepared a careful answer assembled from the available facts, useful without being vulnerable. She had been building that version for about 4 years now. "I need to know something first," she said. "I was moved here as a piece in someone else's game. Whitfield's, possibly Voss's. I was not consulted about this. I was positioned. She held his eyes. Do you see me as a person here, or as another piece that arrived conveniently for a different set of purposes? He did not answer immediately. She had learned not to read his pauses as hesitation. They were how he thought, the way her notebook was how she thought. And interrupting either was how you got bad information. I see the person who read my mother's journal, he said, and wrote down what she found, and didn't flinch from what it meant. She absorbed that. That's not an answer about me. That's an answer about what I did. They're the same thing, Colt said. For people like us, what we do is what we are. Everything else is just circumstances. A pause. You weren't placed here by anyone. You were placed here by a man who underestimated what you do with the placement. He looked at her steadily. That's not his plan. That's your outcome. The anger shifted again. Not less, she was not going to pretend it was less, but differently oriented the way a river changes when the terrain changes. Still moving fast, moving somewhere. All right, she said. Then let's finish this. They met that evening, the three of them, in the barn, because the barn had become the room they used for things that couldn't be said in the main house, and because some conversations need a ceiling high enough to contain them. Nora laid out the structure. 3 sets of records, federal, filing the Whitfield-Voss connection as the thread that tied Boston to Montana and prevented the case from being heard as a local land dispute. Fletcher listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was how he received information. He had already partially arrived at himself, a verification rather than a revelation. Colt stood with his arms crossed and his back against the stall door and said nothing until she was finished. Helena, he said. Federal Circuit Court there has jurisdiction. The judge is from Chicago. No local interests. She looked at both of them. I'll send the package tomorrow. It has to go from the next town east. I won't trust the Red Rock Post for something like this. A pause. Voss has managed every piece of leverage he's had through legal channels. If he can't touch the channel, he can't touch the case. Fletcher said, I want it known that the Reed claim is part of the same filing, not a separate action. It will be. My father never got to argue his own case in any court that wasn't already decided. He said it evenly without heat. I want the record to show that someone finally did. She wrote it down. They talked for another hour. By the time they were done, the filing package existed as a concept precise enough to build into the physical thing. There was the quality in the room that comes after sustained effort toward a single point. Not relief, not yet, but the particular exhaustion of people who have been carrying something a long way and can finally see where they're putting it down. Nora went to bed that night, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, slept without waking in the middle of it. Augustus summoned her the following morning. She had not told him about the journal. She had not had to. Mrs. Aldous had come to him as Mrs. Aldous apparently always came to him when someone found the room at the end of the hallway, because this was the arrangement they had. The housekeeper kept the secret, and the husband was told when the secret was disturbed. It was a system like all the other systems in this house, and it had been running for 10 years. He was in his office, sitting in the chair he had occupied for most of the conversations she'd had with him. The morning light came through the window behind him, at an angle that showed the details his posture usually concealed, the way he held himself slightly to one side, as though one lung was working harder than the other. The cancer, she understood, moving through its months. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." He looked at the window. The particular quality of his stillness in that moment was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of calculation. This was the stillness of a man sitting inside something that had no exit. "Why didn't you destroy it?" Nora said. It was not a confrontation. She said it the way she said things she genuinely wanted to know, plainly, without pressure. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. The kind of long that isn't avoidance, but excavation, going down to a place that isn't visited. "Because it was hers," he said finally. The room was very still. "She wrote every day for 18 years, he said. "Whatever else was in it, whatever she wrote about me." He looked at his hands. "You cannot spend 18 years with a person and know them entirely, but you can know the shape of their thinking, the way they approached things. She was—" He stopped. A long pause. She was precise. She did not waste words. He looked up. "When I read what she had built in that book, I recognized her in it, even in the parts she built against me." Nora looked at the man in front of her. The man who had taken land that wasn't his, who had silenced a woman who was trying to stop him, who had signed his name at the bottom of the proof of what he'd done 3 years after it was over, in the handwriting of someone entering a record that he alone would ever see. "You loved her," Nora said. "I loved her," he said, "and I destroyed what she was building, and she died in a room I locked her into, and I have been living in this house next to that door for 10 years. He said it without inflection, the way he said everything, not because he didn't feel it, but because the feeling had been there long enough to become the texture of his days, rather than an event within them. She wrote at the end that she was not a woman who frightened easily. She wanted that recorded. He looked at Nora. She was not. That is also correct. Nora thought of a woman who had come west 30 years before her, with a valise and a purpose she was still assembling, who had spent 18 years looking clearly at what her husband was and writing it down with the precision of a person who understood that the work would outlast her, who had written near the end the specific acknowledgement that she knew she was running out of time, and had decided what she wanted the record to say about her anyway. She put the list on the desk. It was the names of the families, 6 of them, with what they had lost in the particulars she had been able to establish from Margaret's journal and Fletcher's records. Not every family. There were more further back that the documentation didn't reach. But these 6 she had. These 6 were specific. "You need to sign this," she said. "Not because the law requires it. The law may not, depending on how the federal case goes. but because if Colt is going to build something on what you've built, he needs to start from a foundation that he can stand on without it shifting under him. She looked at Augustus, and because she started this work, she didn't get to finish it. I am trying to finish it. This is the part I can't do without you. He looked at the list, looked at the window, looked at the list again. These people will not forgive me, he said. No, probably not. Then what is the point? The point, Nora said, is not forgiveness. The point is that the record shows it happened and that someone in a position to know it acknowledged it. Margaret understood that. She wrote it down. Someone should know. And if not me, then no one. She held his eyes. You have an opportunity she did not have, to be the someone. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet she had come to understand in this house as the sound of a man reasoning with something he could not out-argue. Not because the argument was flawless, because the thing on the other side of it was real. She did not speak. The argument had already been made by a woman who had written it down 20 years ago and left it in a locked room for the right person to find. He picked up the pen. Judge Harlan Voss arrived on a Thursday morning with a court order. 2 deputies and the expression of a man who has made his calculations and found them satisfactory. The court order was properly formatted, properly filed, properly stamped with the seal of the Red Rock County Court. It authorized an inspection and assessment of the Briggs Ranch water access infrastructure under the disputed creek diversion claim, with the potential for an asset freeze pending the outcome of the case. Everything about it was legal. Which was the thing that made Harlan Voss dangerous, and that she had been thinking about since she first understood what they were dealing with. Colt met him in the yard. Silas and 4 of the ranch hands stood behind him in the loose arrangement of men who are not forming a line, but have arrived with their presence at approximately the same statement. Nora came out of the main house carrying 3 things. She waited until Voss had finished his opening declaration. The identification of the document, the explanation of his authority, the statement of purpose, and then she said at a volume calibrated for the size of the yard, and everyone in it, Judge Voss. He looked at her. His deputies looked at her. The particular quality of his attention told her he knew who she was, and had already decided she was not relevant. Before you proceed, she said, I want you to know that your name appears 27 times in the journal I'm holding with corresponding dates and sums that document your financial relationship with the Voss-Whitfield operation going back to 1871. She held up the second document. Your cousin's name appears throughout this record, which documents fraudulent accounting in the Boston office of Whitfield Import from 1887 to 1889, assembled by the firm's own bookkeeper. She held up the third, and all of this material, along with land transfer documentation from 6 affected families, was sent yesterday to the Federal Circuit Court in Helena for review. The yard was quiet. Voss looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man performing a rapid calculation. A filing with the Federal Circuit can be contested. A woman with your particular legal history in Boston has limited standing to. She sent it through Mill Haven, Colt said. Voss's attention shifted. Not Red Rock. Colt's voice was level. Mill Haven. Eastern Courier, not Territorial Post. A pause. He was not performing satisfaction. He was too spare for performance, but there was something in the quality of the stillness that followed that was not entirely neutral. I sent my own package to Denver last week. What I had. Different material, different route. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure which of your people were watching the post. He looked at Voss directly. Denver received confirmation of delivery Monday. Nobody had told her. She had not known about Denver. She thought in the space of a second about Colt sitting across from her that morning. They had laid out the plan, saying very little, attending carefully to the things he could control. About how the most useful thing you could do for a plan was not to trust that it would be enough. She looked at him. He did not look at her. He was watching Voss. Voss stood in the yard with his court order in one hand and the arithmetic of his situation in the other, and understood what it added up to. He was a methodical man. That had always been his strength. What it was not was flexible. He put the court order back inside his coat. "We'll be in touch," he said, which was what men in his position said when they had decided to retreat without calling it that. He and his deputies left the way they had come. The yard watched them go. Silas let out a breath beside Colt. "Denver," he said. "Last week," Colt said. Silas nodded once, the nod of a man who has worked for someone long enough to recognize the quality of their decisions, even in retrospect. He went back to what he'd been doing. Nora looked at Colt. "You might have told me," she said. "You might have told me about Millhaven." She considered this. "Fair," she said. "I wasn't certain it would be necessary," he said. "In case it was, I didn't want either of us knowing what the other had done. If they'd taken you in for questioning, you couldn't tell them about Denver. You didn't know." She looked at him for a moment longer. "That's a very practical way to think about it." "I live a practical life," he said, and turned back toward the house. She stood in the yard for another moment after he went in. Around her, the ranch moved back into its ordinary business. Silas's voice from somewhere near the east barn. The sound of someone resuming a task that had been paused. The court order was gone with the man who'd brought it. The yard had already absorbed the event the way working places absorbed events, acknowledging them for exactly the time it took to adjust, then moving forward. She thought, two people in the same situation. Both of them too practical to trust any single route. Neither of them willing to tell the other, because telling would compromise the insurance. Both of them right. She thought there are worse foundations. Then she went back inside. Fletcher Reed left 2 days later with the papers that documented the partial restoration of the Reed land claim, signed by Augustus Briggs in the presence of 2 witnesses and filed with the territorial recorder. Not all of the original, holding a portion, had been sold years ago to a third party, and the chain of title was too complex to unwind quickly. But 200 of the original 340 acres, with a formal acknowledgement of what had been taken and how. He and Colt shook hands in the yard on the morning he departed. "My father would have wanted you to know," Fletcher said that he didn't spend his life hating yours. He was angry for a long time. He was sad for longer. He looked at the land. He just wanted someone to say that what happened had happened, that it was real and it mattered and someone knew. It happened, Colt said. It was real. It mattered. Fletcher looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded the specific nod of a man receiving something he has come a long way to get and is not going to diminish by saying too much about it. He rode south. The dun horse went at the same pace it had come unhurried, carrying a different weight. She was in her room that evening when she took the boarding house newspaper from the inner pocket of her valise, where she had kept it for 6 months. The way you keep things you're not ready to throw away and not ready to look at. She had carried it across the country and into this house and through everything that had followed this one piece of paper, with the red pencil circle around a line of text and a date in the upper corner, that she now understood meant something different than she had thought. The newspaper was from Helena. It was dated 3 weeks before the meeting with Whitfield, in which he had explained the discrepancies with the practiced ease of a man who had already decided what came next. Someone had known 3 weeks before she was formally accused that she was going to need a way out. Someone had prepared the direction she would run. She held it in the lamplight and looked at it and let herself feel the full, clean, precise shape of the thing. Cornelius Whitfield had moved her like a piece on a board, had calculated her isolation, her practicality, her tendency to run toward work rather than away from problems, had offered her the one thing she would not refuse, a door that looked like a decision, and had stood back and watched her walk through it. He had known what she was. He had not known what she would do. There was a difference, and it was the only difference that mattered. She had come here as someone else's instrument. She had arrived as a stranger with no name, no connections, no standing in a territorial court. She had been exactly as calculated a disturbance, something that entered the structure of this ranch and found the cracks in it and put her hands into them without being asked. But no one had told the cracks what to do after that. That had been hers, had been. She folded the newspaper carefully along its existing creases, the way you fold something you have decided to keep, because it is evidence of something, not because it is precious. She set it on the desk. Then she opened her notebook to the last written page and uncapped her pen. Margaret's room was open now. It had been open since the morning Nora had used the key, and no one had made any arrangement to close it again, as though the house itself had accepted the change and moved on. She went up the stairs with her notebook in one hand and Margaret's journal in the other. The hallway was empty, the lamp at the near end burning low. At the door, she stopped and knocked, which she had not done before because she was not alone. Colt was behind her. He had not said when she'd asked him to come why he'd agreed immediately, and she had not asked. Some agreements don't require reasons. The room was as she'd left it. The desk, the shelf, the unfinished embroidery on the wall, the cedar box, the dried lavender, the lamp she'd brought the first morning still where she'd set it unlit. She lit it now. The light moved across the walls in the way of lamplight in small rooms, intimate, uneven, turning the ordinary into something that feels for the duration of the flame, like it has been there longer and will last longer than it has any particular right to. She set Margaret's journal on the desk, opened the single drawer. Inside the cedar box, some folded letters she had not read and did not open now, because some things were not hers to read. She placed the journal in the drawer beside the box. Then she took her own notebook, the one she had been filling since before Boston, since before Whitfield. The record of 4 years of looking at things until they gave up what they were, and set it in the drawer beside the journal. The drawer was slightly small for both. She had to adjust the angle of the notebooks before they would sit flat together, and for a moment they resisted each other the way objects resist being put into spaces they weren't made for. Then they settled. She closed the drawer. Behind her in the doorway, Wren appeared without a sound. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides and looked at the room she had not entered in the 3 years since she'd first read what it contained, and her face had the expression of someone seeing a thing they have been preparing to see for a long time. Not surprise, but arrival. The 3 of them stood in the lamplight in a room that had been closed for 10 years and was now open. And nobody said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The saying had been done. The record was made. The work that had been started by a woman in 1861 with a valise and a purpose she had spent 18 years assembling had arrived finally at something that might be called its completion. And the room knew it the way rooms know things in the settling of dust, in the slight change in the quality of the air, in the particular silence that comes not from nothing happening but from the right thing. Having happened being allowed to rest, she had come here as a piece on someone else's board. She had come 2,000 miles in a direction she had not entirely chosen, carrying evidence she could not yet use, moving toward a place she had never heard of, on the word of a newspaper that had been left on her table by a man who had wanted her contained. She had stayed because she had found something worth staying for. That was the whole of it. There was nothing in that sentence that required expansion or decoration or further explanation. She had stayed because she had found something worth staying for, and in the finding she had become something worth staying as, and those 2 facts placed against each other. In the small drawer of a locked room in the 2nd floor of a ranch house at the edge of the Montana Territory in the year 1889, added up to an accounting that balanced. Nora Calloway stood in the lamplight and let the work be finished. It was enough.